Welcome to a special edition of the Glenn Beck program. I like to call it our Egghead Hour. We have gathered some of the best historians we could find to help America understand the progressive movement and how this presidential administration, at least this is my theory, is using Woodrow Wilson and FDR as a book, as a blueprint. I know, you could hardly control your excitement, but you don't want to miss a second of this if you want to understand what's really happening in America. Come on, let's go. Hello, America. Hope and change. Well, it was a movement that surged Barack Obama into the White House. But it is not the first time America has seen this sort of political uprising of hope and change and progress. There was hope and change way back in the early 20th century, but the name was different. It was progressivism. Have you heard that before? Are you a progressive? It was the shiny new car. Well, now wait a minute, what happened? Well, you see, back in the early 20th century, everybody wanted to take it for a spin. Progressivism had no political boundaries. The Democrats, like Woodrow Wilson, loved it. Republicans, Teddy Roosevelt, loved it. America was stuck in a rut. We needed to make progress. How better to break free than to use progressive tactics? Well, the message resonated with so many Americans, and progressives began winning elections. And then they started to govern. That's where the problem came in. In the response to the repeated bank runs in the early 1900s, progressives came up with an idea: the Federal Reserve System. This flew right in the face of our founders. Thomas Jefferson, he argued that the central bank was, quoting, one of the most deadly hostility existing against the principles and form of our Constitution, end quote. Well, it hadn't taken long to prove Jefferson right, as the worst financial disaster in the U.S. happened largely because of the Fed's continual contraction of the money supply before and during the Great Depression. Didn't work out so well, did it? Progressives also wanted to redistribute the wealth, spread it around a bit. They implemented an income tax. In fact, the name is still a progressive income tax. You see, how did they possibly sell it to the American people? It was easy. They sold it at something, it was just going to lower tariffs. It would only be a tax on the wealthy. That's it. The regular people would never see it. Woodrow Wilson, the progressive Democrat, led passage of the Revenue Act in 1913. Well, the rates that the progressives promised only lasted 4 years. Then all Americans had their taxes jacked up, and they haven't come down since. The bottom tax bracket hasn't paid single-digit percentages in taxes in over 60 years. How's that progress? They first introduced also the first real nanny state effort. What are they doing now? Now they're talking about, hey, we got a nanny state. Hey, don't eat that. You don't want to drink too much of that. Make sure your kid has an apple, right? Well, in 1919, the progressives did the same thing. It was called prohibition, and they convinced the nation to ban drink because they knew better than the people buying booze. Well, what was the final straw on this before they had to go undercover? I think it was the president of peace. Woodrow Wilson ran for re-election, and he just barely won. And he said, we're never going to go to war in Europe. Lo and behold, just a few months later, World War I. But the progressives billed it as the war to end all wars, because progressives thought they had the solution to world conflict. And they brought us the League of Nations, another failure. It led to the United Nations. Well, back by 1920, Americans really had enough, and the progressives knew it, and so they had to go underground. But they never left us. They never changed tactics. They thought, well, just evolve America. They are patient. They have a plan. And while this country has been asleep, we have been co-opted. There are now more than 80 members of the Progressive Caucus. Of the 20 standing committees in the House, 11, over half, are chaired by members of the Progressive Caucus. You want to know why things don't make sense in Washington? This is it. Oh, and of course, there's the Democratic president. Really? If you think he's a Democrat, think again.
To my progressive friends, I would remind you that for decades, the driving idea behind reform has been to end insurance company abuses and make coverage available for those without it. The public option is only a means to that end. And we should remain open to other ideas that accomplish our ultimate goal. And to my Republican friends, I say that rather than making wild claims about a government takeover of health care, we should work together to address any legitimate concerns you may have.
Did you see that? Just in case you're still not convinced.
You will carry on the best progressive, forward-looking values of this proud Commonwealth. Change has always come from places like Wisconsin, the state where the progressive movement was born.
Okay.
Where better to affirm our ideals than here in Wisconsin, where a century ago the progressive movement was born.
All right, so there he is, talking about progressive. And did you notice what was missing when he was talking to the Congress? My progressive friends and my Republican friends. Where are the Democrats? For 100 years, progressives have been using both parties as a host, and they have been feeding on this republic. Tonight, we examine the game plan. Who started it? What does it mean? What is a progressive? What is the difference between existing with the progressives if you believe in the original intent of the founders? And what's coming next? What is the best way to fight them? We go now to our panel of eggheads. R.J. Prestrito in Dallas. He is the author of Woodrow Wilson and the Roots of Modern Liberalism and American Progressivism. Burton Folsom Jr., he's the author of New Deal, Raw Deal, and Larry Schweikart. He is the author of A Patriot's History of the United States. All right. Where do I even begin? Who wants to give me, R.J., let me start with you because your book really opened my eyes, on Woodrow Wilson. So let me go to you. Give me a definition of what a progressive really is.
Well, Glenn, to me, progressivism is all about moving beyond the Constitution, getting beyond the bedrock principles of the American founding. The progressives detested the political ideas behind the Declaration of Independence because they enshrined the idea of individual God-given rights as the end of government. They detested the Constitution because the Constitution put limits on the national government which were designed to uphold those rights. And as you said in your introduction, the progressive dream was one of unlimited national government. Redistribution of wealth was part of that plan. And the progressives knew that the political principles of our founders stood in their way. So progressivism, in a nutshell, is to progress or to move beyond the Constitution.
You guys both agree with that here?
It is. I think it's even more in that there's an assumption about human nature that's built into progressivism.
Okay, let's get into that in a second because I know where you're going, and I can't wait to open that can of worms. But here. Most people, when you say the kinds of things, when I started learning about progressivism,
right,
really learning about it, I thought, well, separate and help me out. If I would define the difference in their heads, it's the difference of revolution of Marxism and evolution of progressivism. Agree?
I think Marxism has an inherent mechanistic quality. This is going to happen regardless of who's in there making it happen. The progressives believe that individuals have a role in making this happen, and they're going to bring it about. So Woodrow Wilson is going to bring about this change.
Okay.
Glenn,
Go ahead.
I like to think of the progressives as conservative socialists. The same aims, the same understanding of the role of the state, no boundary that individual rights can place between the state and the individual. But the change, they want it to take place, as you said, more gradually, more organically. So okay. Conservative socialist is not a bad way to think of it.
All right, and this is, because I want to make sure, because most Americans don't really have a handle on what the progressive movement is. And this is not about the Democrats. This is about the Democrats, the Republicans, right?
Sure. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt was a progressive. Woodrow Wilson was a progressive. Progressivism had strong influence in both parties in the early 1900s, hence the progressive income tax. The whole idea that we can solve problems with government solutions, which means that we have to move beyond the Constitution.
All right, so Larry, if you're an originalist, if you're somebody who says, I believe in the Constitution, I believe in what the founders did, I believe in the American experience,
Right.
Or the experiment, can progressivism and original intent republicanism, if you will, can they survive?
No, they cannot coexist, because the concept of the progressives,
Sometimes their ego takes control. Can we flip this? Can we flip this chalkboard? Because Thomas Jefferson talked about this very thing, and the difference, I think this would be a fundamental difference here. The two enemies of the people are criminals and government. So let us tie the second down with the chains of the Constitution so the second will not become the legalized version of the first. That's the founders saying, you're never going to be able to perfect people. It's always going to be this way.
If you give somebody too much power, eventually that power will corrupt that person and ultimately the nation. You have to have a separation of powers according to the founders. Wilson wanted a centralization of power because you have to centralize power in order to accomplish government programs to redistribute the wealth and improve society along the direction the progressives wanted.
Okay, so when you hear the President of the United States talk about progressivism, and then he says, I want to fundamentally transform America. I'm going to ask each of you. Larry, I'm going to start with you. What does that say to you? What does that mean to you? What is the visceral or intellectual reaction either way?
well, my skin crawls, because it means the Constitution isn't good enough. What we have protecting our country today is not my vision of the country, and I have to get away from whatever we have today. It's dangerous and just really radical. It's the most radical thing any president has ever said.
Burton?
Well, it's the same thing, because it means that we're not going to have rule of law. We're going to have rule by men, an educated elite of men. Power will be transferred to these people, and we will be governed by a small elite.
This is the czars. This is the this company gets a bailout, but this company doesn't.
That's
right.
correct.
Okay.
Exactly.
And RJ, what does it mean to you?
Well, Glenn, liberals have realized that the word liberal is a dirty word in American politics. It has been since the political debate in the 1980s. They've latched onto this idea of progressives because it sounds like a nicer word, but it also accurately reflects their view of the state.
All right. But RJ, isn't it true that progressive was a hot word? Liberal meant something entirely different around the turn of the century here in America. It meant maximum amount of freedom. It meant small government. It was more of a libertarian kind of idea. And then the progressives came in. They permeated both parties. It became popular until America saw what it was. And then it kind of really had to, it kind of had to shed the, well, people aren't really digging this. And they kind of had to go underground into the liberal thing. Then they destroyed the word liberal because it meant progressive. And then they dusted the word off progressive again and said, no, we have the answer. It's progress. Isn't this
Yes,
have we gone full circle here?
The term liberalism was hijacked from our founders, from the founding generation. Maybe the clearest progressive on this, Glenn, is the progressive philosopher John Dewey, who was a very influential figure in the early part of the 20th century. And he hijacked the term liberalism for the progressives. He said, well, there's the old liberalism. That's the liberalism of the Declaration of Independence, where it's about the liberty of the individual.
Two places here when we come back. I want to show you, America, how they have changed our history books and why they did that. And it goes back again to the Founding Fathers. They had to disconnect us from our Founding Fathers and the roots. And how they did that in the court system as well around 1920, and why they did that coming up in just a second. That's really what progressive means. Instead of a revolution, which you'd never accept, it's an evolution. It's just slow progress. It's ever evolving. It's living. That was not the original intent with our founders, and it is really the definition of the progressive movement. We're back with R.J. Pastrito, Burton Folsom Jr., and Larry Schweikart. We're looking at progressives, America, and I want to go to the law here, and I want to go to R.J. RJ, help me out because my memory is a little sketchy here. I'm trying to remember the name of the guy. I believe he was the head of Harvard Law in about 1920, and he's the guy who made a fundamental change in America. They no longer studied the Constitution or constitutional law or the founders. They changed to study case law, which again, no revolution, just evolution. So we slowly but surely keep moving away from the Constitution and the founders, and we end up just looking at the last case, right?
That's right, and I believe the fellow you're talking about is Roscoe Pound, who was dean of Harvard Law School. They're at the tail end of the progressive era, and Pound was basically someone who's responsible for applying progressive ideas to the law. And what it's called today is legal realism. That's the name of the theory or the legal philosophy. And basically what legal realism does, Glenn, is it tries to take what the Constitution says, which isn't what a lot of these judges think it needs to say, and through case law, through decisions, they apply it, they, shall we say, read it flexibly, liberally, right, and make it say what they think it needs to say. And therefore, what you look at, what you study when you study law, is not the law itself, is not the Constitution, but what other judges have said the law means.
Exactly right.
And that's why it's a case law approach. It
would be like if you're repairing or restoring a car and you never go back to the original schematic of the car, you just see all of the repairs and what everybody has done to the car. Well, a 1965 Mustang, 200 years from now, if you're only basing what you're doing on all of the repairs, it ain't going to be anything like a 1965 Mustang, right?
That's right. And Glenn, this is why you see during the Supreme Court confirmation hearings, all of the progressive senators are really worked up about precedent. They're obsessed with precedent. What that means is they want to make sure these potential justices are going to be guided by what other liberal judges have said over the last 80 years about the Constitution, not what the Constitution actually says.
All right. Now let me go to Woodrow Wilson. Bring a picture of Woodrow Wilson up. I hate this. I got to tell you, 2 years ago, I knew nothing about Woodrow Wilson. I hate this SOB. He was an evil, evil dude. And did more. America should know about Woodrow Wilson because he, I think, has done more to change America than most presidents. In fact, a series of presidents combined. Would you agree with that?
Well, he has. You look at the Federal Reserve, the progressive income tax, but manipulating with wages and hours, that it's the government's job to determine wages that might be paid, hours of work that might be done.
But he also did all the work on administrative work, administration, right? He was the guy who wrote it before the early 1900s. And then he also was a guy who helped change history. If I'm not mistaken, it was during his administration that a group of professors, I think from Columbia, progressive professors, got together and said, you know what? Our founders were racist white people. What do you say? And they decided to really make progress. We had to detach from the history that we had and make progress from that. Can you tell that story?
History becomes a tool for the present to affect the future. It no longer becomes a means of looking at the past, but it becomes an active weapon to change society.
We saw last week, and we ran a special last week on the history of the 20th century and fascism and the Soviet Union and Hitler and everything else. And we saw how much has been changed, how much has been left out, et cetera, et cetera. How much of the history that we're taught in textbooks, because I read RJ's book on Woodrow Wilson, and all the doors opened up on me, and I went, oh my gosh, we've been being lied to like crazy. How much of history, in America history, that we're being taught in schools and colleges and also elementary, et cetera, is accurate?
Well, a lot is inaccurate. Starting with the progressives came the attack on the Constitution, that the founders were not motivated by putting together a document that had eternal truths in it, that one generation should follow, the next generation should follow, and so on. But it was a self-interested document that the founders wrote it and designed it to protect their economic interests.
Right. And it became also that when you say eternal truths, that God was not really there, and it doesn't matter. The Declaration of Independence shouldn't even be read today. Wasn't it Wilson? RJ, do you remember? Wasn't it Wilson that said the preamble of the Constitution should never be read, and the Declaration of Independence has zero relevance to any other age other than 1776?
Yeah, Wilson said, if you want to understand the real Declaration of Independence, disregard the preface. That is to say, that part of it where, you know, those small things like the natural equality of all men, our God-given rights, these things are the permanent ends of government. So what are you left with? You're left with a litany of grievances against George III. That is to say, the Declaration is just a kind of historical document. It's if you're kind of interested in what George III was doing, that was a problem. Well, you could read those things, but really no relevance for us.
Right, and dismiss, all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator. All of that is garbage and it means nothing. Just look at the list of grievances. Okay, when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about the relationship that progressives have where they know better. They do. They're smarter than you. They know better. Back in just a second.
Barack Obama, one of the great virtues of Barack Obama is consistency. He is exactly who he's always been. He's always worked across ideological lines, partisan lines, to try and achieve progressive goals, and that's what he's going to do as president.
In fact, I've often thought the current president is really sort of Woodrow Wilson reincarnated. People admire him for the same reason they admire Woodrow Wilson. He said things that sounded so wonderful, and yet if you challenge those people by saying, name one Woodrow Wilson did, they can't tell you.
I have to tell you, my radio audience of like 3 years ago was so sick of hearing me talk about Woodrow Wilson. I'm like, you've got to read about this guy. You are not going to believe this is what's headed our way. And boy, here we are. And when Thomas Sowell said that, he was on my program saying that, I don't know, about 2 weeks ago. And I thought, oh my gosh. Yes, it is Woodrow Wilson. We're going to get into comparing some of the stuff here in just a second on Woodrow Wilson and what's happening. But I want to take you here. When was the last time our egghead panel read Walter Lippmann and the Phantom Public? This is from 1926, and while I was trying to study up on the progressives, I don't know, this was a couple years ago, I read this, and this is the book that finally made me put it down and say, I can't read these people anymore. This talks about, with contempt, people. That people are just too stupid, and we've got to breed their stupidity out of them, and there's got to be some sort of genetic thing that we can tweak or work. And I appeal to the microbiologist to be able to find what it is. And he then talks about eugenics. This is Mein Kampf light. Am I wrong with that idea?
No, the progressives definitely wanted to marry the perfection of individuals through genetic restructuring, eugenics, to the perfection of individuals through public policy.
Okay.
It's a two-part plan.
And this goes, Burton, this goes to the idea that there are stupid people, and we shouldn't listen to them, and there are just people that aren't good enough to, vote, et cetera, right?
Well, that's why we need to have the educated elite have significantly more power and authority, and we need to not have checks and balances, but centralize authority in the educated elite, and eugenics becomes part of this message.
Now, this isn't some crazy man. This is Walter Lippmann. Anybody? RJ, do you know who Walter Lippmann? Can you give me a real quick history, or anybody here can give me a quick history on him? Walter Lippmann?
Lippmann was very involved in the origins of the New Republic, one of the premier organs of opinion on the left. It was sort of the organ of progressive opinion. One of the interesting things about Lippmann, he lived well on into the 20th century. He, like Roscoe Pound, actually became somewhat of a critic of the progressive movement late in life. Sort of kind of saw the light. Really kind of woke up about the capacity to actually accomplish all these things that the progressives had in view.
But Walter Lippmann, if I'm not mistaken,
he's a Harvard grad. He's very well educated, part of the elite.
And he was, if I'm not mistaken, he had something to do with CBS as well. I think he was early on with the Columbia Broadcasting System. But he and Edward House were instrumental in the Treaty of Versailles.
Yes, they were both there.
Both there, which was with Woodrow Wilson. They both also co-founded, if I'm not mistaken, the Council of Foreign Relations. The Council of Foreign Relations was a progressive idea of let's take media and eggheads and figure out what the idea is, what the solution is, then teach it to the media, and then they'll let the masses know what should be done. Right?
In many ways, Lippmann is the father of modern journalism. I mean, many people kind of look at him as the father of modern journalism. And this is how we're going to teach the people where journalism changes under Lippmann from reporting facts to starting to include editorializing.
To teach, because they, again, knew better, right?
Exactly.
Okay. Go ahead.
Glenn, on this question of knowing better, it's very interesting to read some things that Woodrow Wilson wrote as a young man coming out of Princeton. He was looking at the scene in American politics and saying, where's the place for people like me, for me and my educated friends? Look at politics, it's so corrupt. And that's why they looked to expert administration. They were very idealistic. They thought that would be the place where the upper and middle class, the educated people could make their mark. And it's one of the reasons why you see the progressive model have administrative power in view.
These are the people, if I'm not mistaken, Woodrow Wilson back in the 1880s and people like him, they started looking back over to Europe. As Europe was building the Statue of Liberty to teach their people, be more like America, our elites started looking over to Europe, and particularly Germany, right? And they said, we got to be more like them.
They began the PhD programs. Americans went over to Germany, received PhDs. Johns Hopkins University was established, the first PhD granting institution in the United States, based on the German model. And then we emulated the Germans. We copied them.
Which at the time, that's Marx, that's Nietzsche, that's all these really nightmarish things that turn into the Holocaust eventually.
And in terms that you were talking about fallacies in textbooks, this is part of the place where you get something called historicism, which says that there is no truth in the past. Right. There is only what you make it at the time. So don't worry too much about getting to the truth. Let's reshape history as we go.
I prefer the word progressive, which has a real American meaning, going back to the progressive era at the beginning of the 20th century. I consider myself a modern progressive.
You know, my hero is a guy named Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt used to say, walk softly, talk softly, but carry a big stick.
When I was watching the debate and then I saw John McCain say that, I was like, please, America, please read history. Please, please, please. This is why we always feel like there's no choice. It's like we vote for one or we vote for the other and we end up at the same place. This is why. We're back with R.J. Pestrito, Burton Folsom Jr., and Larry Schweikart. We're talking about the progressive movement, the early 20th century. Did any of you guys see that live happen with Hillary Clinton?
Yes.
You did? And what was your thought, Larry? When that happened, what did you think?
At least she's telling the truth.
Yeah, but I mean, I thought, oh my gosh, everybody quick Google early 20th century progressive, because that'll stop it dead in its tracks, and yet people, it didn't, because nobody knows who these people are. Are they different today, fundamentally different today, progressives, than they were in the early 20th century?
They're very similar.
Well, Glenn,
Go ahead, RJ.
Right.
I think that they're similar in the following respect. They think that government is whatever it needs to be. Whatever any human problem is, whatever any crisis comes up, government's got to be there to meet that. That was the progressives.
But
they thought history drove government. That's today.
You know, there's a few things here that I think are interesting, because here's the progressives then and now. And if you look at it, okay, here's Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt is John McCain, a progressive. He wants health care. He wants all these big government programs. But the difference between the progressives of Republicans and the progressives of Democrats, if I'm not mistaken, John McCain says, we're America, and we'll send the troops in. We'll do it. We'll dictate to the rest of the world. That was Theodore Roosevelt as well, right? That's the Republican version.
Yes.
Then you have Woodrow Wilson, who is really more of Barack Obama, whereas, well, we could even use, we don't have Bill Clinton up here, but we can even use George Bush, which is more UN, correct?
Little bit with Bush. I would make a separation.
He's more...
Yeah, there you go.
He's in between, because he did favor the tax cuts and the capital gains cuts.
I'm talking about war specifically.
Sure.
The difference between a Republican progressive and a Democratic progressive and our founders said we should be Switzerland. We should stay out of everybody's business, be friends with everybody. I mean, if you're going to mess with us, we're going to pound you. Thomas Jefferson created the Marines for the Islamic pirates that were happening, right?
Yeah.
And so they didn't take any guff, but they weren't spreading democracy. Progressives spread democracy and gooey goodness. One does it through a UN or a League of Nations. One does it through our U.S. military. Right?
Good distinction.
Fair.
Okay. Fair? Just fair?
That's fair. It's a fair
It's like it's okay.
Just.
It's like
It's
okay,
just.
it's not okay. Good. Thank you. So what is the difference? First of all, who's this guy? John Dewey. Okay, we just talked about John Dewey. FDR. Who is Barack Obama more like?
Well, he's more like Franklin Roosevelt. The two of them very much believe in using government to solve problems. When the programs fail, you simply raise taxes, you have scapegoats. Wall Street is a scapegoat to both men. The programs fail, stimulus packages fail, you go back and you have businessmen to blame. The program is a good idea, progressivism is good, but it didn't work this time because businessmen got in the way.
Let me go here on something and see if you guys can. This is what's his name? George Bernard Shaw. We just played some tape this week and last week. He's frightening. He is absolutely frightening. Would you agree, Larry? You're laughing. Yeah, he's frightening. I mean, he's the guy who said, hey, you know, chemists, please come up with a humane gas to get rid of some of these people that just don't know any better. Here's Margaret Sanger. Now, Margaret Sanger, Hillary Clinton has talked about Margaret Sanger as Planned Parenthood.
Yes.
Also, Planned Parenthood, its roots with Margaret Sanger, a progressive, really more in line with George Bernard Shaw. It's to get rid of the undesirables. Is it not? True or false?
The eugenics fits in here very, very carefully.
Correct, correct. But Woodrow Wilson also has a lot in common here because he's a real, I mean, he's a dirtbag racist, is he not?
He is. The number of, in fact, we had very few African Americans in federal government, but they were reduced under Wilson.
And did we not, RJ, did I not read in your book that Woodrow Wilson, we had a desegregated military until Wilson, and he resegregated everybody.
He resegregated the whole civil service. Yes, Glenn.
Okay. Now you have to decide. These are all progressives here today. You have to decide, do we see any of the traits of some of these progressives now? I think the answer is yes, but you do your own homework. We'll be right back in a second. All right. We have tried to, in the last week, give you an idea of what the progressive movement really was and what it is today. Where does history meet the present and possibly our future? We've laid out the problems. I want to talk a little bit about the solutions, and maybe I'm too focused on education is the solution. Self-education is the solution. But gentlemen, help me out here. I think once progressivism is exposed for what it truly is, what the roots are, who's involved, what their motivations are, and what they believe the founders were all about, I think it disintegrates. Does anybody disagree with that?
No.
RJ?
No, Glenn, the progressives knew that they weren't going to get very far during their own time by citing, Hegel and Marx and the rest of the lot. And so they really tried to put progressivism under the guise of the tradition of the American founding. Franklin Roosevelt did that as well. So to the extent that people become aware of what's really at work in the progressive movement, both of yesterday and today, I think that's the only hope we have.
Go ahead.
At Hillsdale College, where RJ and I both teach, we have a required course on the Constitution. I think if we had colleges and schools across the nation requiring courses on the Constitution, studying the document, what does it say, and then what do other people say that it says?
Right.
And we can study the progressives in that light, and people can see the dichotomy, see how they're different, and go from there.
The interesting thing, Larry, that I see is, if you read Democracy in America, or if you read anything from the 1800s, you will see that people in pubs or in bars or on the street, in offices, they actually discussed the Constitution. They actually talked about it and said, well, no. And the founders, the most brilliant thing that I think the founders did, when the Constitution is changed, you don't erase anything, you add it. For instance, the progressive prohibition is still in the Constitution. It's just repealed later. So you leave the scars of history so you can see, oh, we made a really bad mistake here. When did we stop talking in public about changing the Constitution, for instance, health care? In the 1930s, FDR said we got to have a second Bill of Rights. When did that happen? When did we unplug, really?
I would say it was sometime in between the end of World War II and the end of the Great Society. That's where you start to lose the concept that you're actually dealing with the Constitution and not just whatever some president or legislature decides it wants to throw in there.
See, give me, if somebody doesn't want their head to hurt, because RJ, I swear to you, I love your book, but it made my eyes bleed. It was, I've never read, it's
you
like...
You look pretty good now. You look like you survived it. Okay.
I was reading it and I'm like, okay, I got to read that paragraph again. What the hell does that even mean?
Think of my poor students.
Give me, besides your own books, give me one book each where you say, if you're going to understand something critical for America and its history or the progressive movement, this is what you should read. Anybody?
I'd like the book A Conflict of Visions by Thomas Sowell. It's right there.
This one?
Yes.
Why? What's in it?
Because he outlines what goes behind the thinking of a progressive and what goes behind the thinking of a constitutionalist in the areas of law, in the areas of economics, in all sorts of areas of life. What are they thinking when they come up with the ideas that they have?
Larry?
Liberal Fascism by Jonah Goldberg.
It's
fantastic book.
Unbelievable. RJ?
How about the Federalist Papers? That's what we make our students read at Hillsdale
the one that
College.
makes your head hurt.
It's got everything right there.
The one that makes your head hurt.
You got it.
Yeah. You know what the problem is, honestly? I think guys like you, I think we need really smart people that can take the Federalist Papers and rewrite them for the common man. Change the language. I read George Washington's farewell address, which is brilliant. But, I don't know how anybody listened to these guys back then, because it's really difficult.
It is.
You know what I mean? If we rewrite these things in common language, people can access them again a lot easier.
Of course, that's what the progressives tried to do, rewrite them so that the common man can understand them.
It's just that the common people are so stupid, you know. We'll be back. Final thoughts in just a second. Charlie Rose, this show ain't. I can't thank you enough for watching and being interested in the Republic and its history. because I asked our guests not to promote their own books, I will tell you these 3 books should be read.